Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone. We have this title slide just to make sure you're in the right spot, but this is strategic use of statewide OER surveys. And I'm only going to have this up here just to basically give you a grounding of where you are, but let me stop sharing and get into this. My name is Kevin Corcoran. I'm from the Connecticut State Colleges and University Systems, and I'm going to be driving this conversation with some wonderful colleagues that I have across the state. So what I'd like to do right now is just do a quick round of introductions before we get into this conversation. Just as a note, please use the chat. We'll try to respond in real time since we have a number of folks on the panel. And we won't be actually sharing any slides. It's going to be a highly interactive conversation, we hope. So with that, Abbey.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Abbey Elder. I'm the Open Access and Scholarly Communication Librarian at Iowa State University, and I've been brought on to this panel to talk a little bit about my work helping to pull together a statewide survey for Iowa OER.
Great. Michelle and Kylah.
Good evening / afternoon, depending on where you are in time zone. I'm Michelle Singh. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Digital Learning at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and had the pleasure of working with one of our fellow community college consortiums on the surveys of both design and development with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Kylah Torre.
Hi, I'm Kylah Torre. I'm Director of Digital Learning at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and I will turn it over, I guess, to Judith, who's next.
Thank you, Kylah. I'm Judith Sebesta, and I serve as the Vice President for ISKME Labs at the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management and Education. And we served as a research partner on the Texas OER survey and landscape analysis. But my former position, I also served as the Executive Director of Digitex that Michelle mentioned, and so worked on the two previous surveys that have been administered. Let me turn it over to my colleague, Anastasia.
Hi, my name is Anastasia Karaglani, and I'm a research associate at ISKME. And my role in the OER landscape survey was to analyze the quantitative data. And Marisa? Oh, no.
No, I'll take it right back. And, I mentioned at the onset my name and where I'm from, but I also serve as a statewide coordinator for a legislatively created OER council in Connecticut. And what we're hoping to do right now is really get into the guts of it, of how each of us came to have a state survey need. How did we come about getting it executed? What was the interesting nuggets of information that we pulled out of that? So Abbey, I'm going to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your initiative and how it came to be.
Yeah, I think mine is probably the easiest to talk about because it's the least official. So Iowa OER is a group of volunteers brought together by the Midwest Higher Education Compact as part of their statewide action teams in 2018. We're a volunteer group of state leaders interested in supporting OER. And as part of that work, the first thing we wanted to do after just meeting each other was to run a landscape analysis of what's happening in the state. How can we build connections with people that are already doing this work? And how can we learn more about what people are doing across the state of Iowa. So the first thing we did was pull together a survey to sort of learn a little bit more about that background and where we could go from there to support other people that were getting interested in OER. And I will go ahead and share a link to our past survey reports and the survey itself in the chat for those who are interested.
Great. So Michelle and Kylah, can you tell us a little bit about how Texas got into this?
All right, I'm going to take that one. So Texas, back in 2018, well, first of all, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is a state agency, and we coordinate all of the universities and community colleges in Texas. The legislature in 2018 passed a bill that established an OER grant program and also asked for a feasibility study for a statewide OER repository. So they were really becoming interested in OER and starting to put some funding behind it. And we realized at the time that there were a lot of pockets of OER work happening in Texas, but we didn't have a full view of what the scope was of things that were going on. So Judith, when she was working at Digitex, and we got together with ISKME at the time and decided that we needed to do a landscape survey to get a better view of what was going on in the different universities and community colleges. And so that was the first iteration. We did the first iteration in 2019, and it has become, well, we've done 2 now, so it is now a biennial survey.
Michelle or Judith or any other comments on this? Well, I think similar here in Connecticut, it's a mixture of ways that we got to this. So while we have a state OER council that was formed in 2019, there was a blue ribbon task force that was created legislatively in 2016. And that was charged to get a sense of what were the opportunities and barriers in our state related to OER adoption. And at that time, what we did is we followed suit to what the Babson survey was, and North Dakota State had done it previously. So we took an offshoot of that and sort of got a sense of what the temperature was in Connecticut, which led to a legislative report. And lo and behold, some of the recommendations in there formed a statewide council that had 3 main areas of responsibility. One was managing a grant program. The second one was doing an annual summit, which I know some of you have been to, and thank you. And the third one was a survey. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put a link in the chat where you can see the past years. And the primary focus of this legislative survey that is now going into its second year is really to quantify the use of OER, especially in high impact courses. So obviously those with high enrollment, high textbook costs. But it was also to sort of gauge the level of awareness and promotion that was going around at the individual campuses and get a sense of what tactics they were using and where the gaps might be. And then beyond that, it really was a gap analysis across the board for support structures. So very similar to what has happened in Iowa and in Texas. But I think what's a little bit more interesting in going into this of why it came to be is how. And so, Abbey, can you tell us a little bit about the process that you took to get your survey out and some of the challenges you faced?
Sure thing. It's really interesting going round robin like this. For those who are listening in, our first prep for this was a very open discussion of back and forth. So this is a lot more structured for your sake, and I hope you appreciate it. But sort of getting things together for the first time was really interesting for us, in part because we were lucky to be coming in late 2018, early 2019, after a big boom in people supporting OER had just happened. So we were able to take some survey questions from Carly in Illinois and from Colorado's OER team and use that as a base for the survey that we were building together. And by taking those questions, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel and think about, well, what do we need to ask and what data do we need to pull from? That really helped us with getting things started. But some of the challenges of this was then, okay, we've got a survey, we've built it out. How do we get it out to people, and who do we include in this conversation? Who do we send it to in the first place? And I was very lucky again to be a part of the Iowa OER team, which had leadership from the Department of Education on it, who had direct contact with the community college CAOs. So they were able to get it out to the leads of community colleges. We had someone from our Board of Regents there who could send things out to the provosts. And so for the dissemination, we ended up sending it to the highest level of each college with a note that you might not be the right person to answer these questions. Please forward it to whoever you think might know what this means, because as many of us know, the person who actually knows what's happening with OER on your campus probably is not your lead administrator. So since that time, we've shared it out about 4 times so far on an annual basis with small changes year over year. A couple of things that we had challenges with early on was making sure that people actually were able to answer the survey. So we didn't think ahead of time that someone might actually want a copy of these questions, or, oh, someone might actually want to know why they're filling this out and what it does for them. So one thing we did after the first year was let people request a copy of the final report as they're submitting their survey, so that they can get a copy of, here's how our campus matches up to everyone else in the state. You can say, here's the average, and we're clearly doing more or we're clearly doing less, as sort of a way to get some push for funding and other support. In addition to that, again, we had a continuous improvement of the survey year over year, specifically adding questions toward the end to answer questions that were timely. So for example, in 2020, 2021, we asked people, hey, has the pandemic affected your initiative at all? Has it improved it? Has it made it harder? What did the move to digital for even a short period of time do for your program? Just so we could pull some of that data and use it to help people as they're building up their programs some more and answering these questions. So really, creating the survey was the easy part. The hard part came in getting it to people and figuring out what the heck are we going to do with this at the end of the day. And I think that it's gotten a little bit easier year over year.
Thank you. So Michelle, Kylah, can you talk about how Texas came to be?
And so very similar to Abby's conversation with Iowa on identifying those key people to be the distribution factor for you is a critical point. To talk about the survey before we jump into that, I think we were very fortunate to have a partner in ISKME to be able to really look at what did we want to investigate, what did we want to study, and leveraging their expertise with their national partnerships and their experience in this space already with all of the different groups that they're associated with, being able to bring that into Texas was a really big benefit, being able to contract with someone that would provide the lens outside of just the state of Texas, but really be able to get us that national scope in part of the designing of our question set. And I'll hand it over to Judith and Anastasia in a little bit so they can talk a little bit more specifically about the survey instrument. But I think one of the biggest parts that we realized was a major benefit, again, in collaboration with Digitex, was we had a group that was already looking at the community colleges. Digitex is a community college consortium. We had the ability to connect with HRIs as well as university systems from the coordinating board. So putting together this idea of these two strong partners that were advocates for OER and creating a central memo that went to all the chief academic officers and the chief instructional officers provided a really great return on completion rates for our survey. The beauty was that we learned from our first engagement to our second. At the beginning, we hadn't included HRIs and we hadn't necessarily gone out to our private institutions and then thought, what are we missing? What are we not getting in this full first iteration? And how can we expand on some of the knowledge of those that are currently doing the work? And we had some really great findings in that process. Being able as well, we all like to think that we fully have a grasp of OER. Maybe we don't know that, right? But we all automatically have an idea of what OER are. We may not be able to say, what is a low cost course? We may not be able to say, what are we defining as low cost? Because that's so institution specific that we realized some of those different barriers as we were designing this particular study. We in Texas don't collect the information as to how much cost savings do you have for your students. We have a way of identifying those courses within a schedule, but we don't necessarily have a way of uniformly being able to quantify what that looks like. And some of those pieces were really heavy thought leader collaborations to figure out what is in the next iteration, the way that we'll be quantifying some of that and collecting some of it. But I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our ISKME partners to talk a little bit more about the actual instrument, some of those gaps that we had and challenges and successes.
Michelle, that was a really great overview, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to defer to my colleague Anastasia, who was instrumental in the survey design. But one thing I did want to say is that in the true spirit of open, in creating the questions for the first survey, the 2019 survey, we did borrow from a survey that had been published by UNESCO, the OER Indicators for National Adoption and Impact. And so we were able to draw on that openly licensed survey to build out a few of the questions to have a starting place. And you will notice if you look at our reports that both of our surveys are licensed CC BY, unless otherwise indicated, so others can build on that too. But let me turn it over to Anastasia to talk a little bit about the design of the survey instrument.
So I find the survey very comprehensive, and what I appreciate very much about both surveys, but especially the 2021 that we expanded a lot, is the depth. I appreciate very much that there is a subgroup of questions that assess in depth the practice or the concept that it is assessing. I would like to discuss two challenges. One that is related to the design of the survey, and the other that has to do with who is the right respondent for the survey. In the survey, we have a question that actually we have 3 questions in the 2021 survey that ask the respondents to indicate the percentage of fully OER courses that they have in the institution. And we realized that institutions that are at the beginning of the OER journey, sometimes they tend to overestimate the percentage of fully OER courses. These questions, there are 3 questions, very similar. One is for undergraduate courses, one is for graduate courses, and the third is for undergraduate courses by discipline. And these are closed-ended, and the respondents can choose between 0% of our courses are fully OER, or approximately 10%, 25%, and so on and so forth. So we realized that this is a difficult question for people to respond accurately. And I think for the next round of survey, this question could be revised or changed to be more valid. The other challenge that I want to discuss with you today is who is the right person to respond when we have a college district. In 2019, we sent the survey to all campuses, to each campus of a college district, and we heard back saying that some people said that I'm the person responsible for OER in our district, and I complete the same survey multiple times, and it doesn't really help. So we changed our practice for the 2021 survey, and we requested one survey for the college districts. However, this summer, for a different project, we had the opportunity to speak in a focus group to 7 different people that represented 7 campuses of a district. And we realized that sometimes the OER work is quite different, and the engagement, the commitment is very different from campus to campus. And I think this finding, again, this realization will guide hopefully the next, the development and the dissemination practices of the next survey.
You know, it's interesting, you know, so much of what both Iowa and Texas have shared with ISKME, you know, is the same story with Connecticut. You know, the story of building the survey was less than the filling out. There's a great moment where the 2 public higher ed systems in Connecticut collaborated. So the University of Connecticut system and the Connecticut State Colleges University system coming together and building our survey set with some help from others like Judith, and giving us some inspiration. But I think the challenge is to what everybody said before, real echoing this, is that distribution was one of the biggest challenges we had. Historically, the way that our state legislative body is set up, we only have access to our presidents and provosts. So we're very dependent on that list and having it get filtered down to the right person. We don't have designated OER contacts at every one of our campuses. And our survey, being statewide, included public and private institutions. So there was a little bit of guessing in the dark for who the right people were. We did do follow-ups to friends of OER to see if we could get to the right people, but that distribution and dissemination was the biggest challenge. The second one was data collection. because we were asking folks to report across an academic year, what's the number of high impact courses that had adoptions? We're also asking for enrollment numbers, and then we were projecting cost savings or costs in general. The challenge we have is that the majority of our institutions in the state had no data collection structures in place. We had a small group that had adopted a course designation of NOLO through our 12 community colleges, but that was no cost and low cost summed up together. So there was no way to separate the OER only from the commercial low cost. So we had a real big data challenge in getting the right stuff in and getting it to the right people. We also had problems with definitions. While we defined it on screen what high impact meant based on the legislation, folks were saying, well, I define high impact as something that has a high impact to the workforce. That may be true, but that may not be a high enrolled with high textbook costs. That may be a different definition. So there were some challenges in us trying to gather the data to meet these top 20 disciplines that had been identified. So those were some of the challenges that we had that really mirror what I've heard from Abbey and from Michelle. Looking at where we go from here, though, I know that we all have lessons learned. And I know, Abbey, you wanted to go for a little bit less structured approach here. So perhaps what we can do is just maybe jump in for the next few minutes here and just share whatever lessons learned were the most important to us and maybe how you correct that going forward.
Kevin, could I just jump in and follow up on this discussion about dissemination and also response rates? I just want to say that in Texas, I think you can't overestimate the impact that having as a partner, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board had on response rates for our response. So for our survey. So having a coordinating board like this that was able to assist in that really was invaluable for us. And, relatively speaking, they were quite high response rates. Of course, we'd like this to increase this the next time. But for the first survey, we sent it to 158 institutions, public and private across the state. And we got 100 institutions that responded. The next year, we added 11 health-related institutions to those who we disseminated the survey to. So that was 169 total institutions, and we got a response rate of 111. So the coordinating board really was instrumental. They're the ones who sent out, I believe, as Michelle said, sent out the memo to all of the institutions, as well as ensuring that the private institutions received an invitation to complete it as well. I think in Texas, the response rate perhaps was the lowest for our private nonprofit independent institutions. So I think there's a lesson learned there, perhaps, that we can work to try to increase that response rate.
That's a great point. I mean, having a better idea of who the actual completers are, who are the folks that are going to be tasked with this, if there was a better way to identify those and market directly, I still think that there, you do need institutional leadership to be aware and supportive of this. But if there's a better way to target the completers, that's definitely a lesson learned for us.
Absolutely. I want to jump on that a little bit and say for dissemination and getting information back, one of the interesting things we've had happen to us was when two people from the same institution filled out a survey, the administrator that got the email and then someone else that learned about it from a peer and got the link. And the administrator filled it out and said, yeah, we're not doing anything. Here's the data. We exist. We're not doing anything. Good to know this is something the state cares about. And then the staff member who was working at one of the departments as a faculty member said, yes, we have a small committee. We've been meeting pretty regularly. Here's the number of courses we're supporting. And then we had to say, okay, well, we got these two sets of data. We're going to use the one that says they're doing something because clearly they're doing something. And then we have to figure out how to report that back to the administrator to say, good news, there's more happening than you knew about. But sometimes dissemination, when you start at the highest level, can stop there, even when there's more to learn.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about some of the changes that we made. This week we'll be launching the second round of our survey, so it's only less than 2 years old here, and we thought we did a good job and had enough eyes look at it the first round. But based on the feedback of the completers, we weren't as clear as we could have been. We knew what we meant, they didn't. And we didn't necessarily understand the data challenges they all faced. So one of the tasks we did this past summer was rewrite a majority of the question prompts and have more concrete, simplified steps that spell out. And then we included an expanded glossary of terms, just so everybody was on the same page. So whether that works or not, we'll have to tell you in a couple months.
The state of Texas had, just before we began doing these surveys, had just passed a definition as law of open educational resources. So we were able to use that definition within the survey instrument as a guide for what, at least for the purpose of the survey, we were considering to be OER.
You know, there's two that I heard from Abbey that I would repeat as lessons learned. Is one is having the offline copy of the questions. So especially if it's going to take some time and effort, folks can look at those. But I think everybody has said this in some form, is borrow whenever possible. There's some great surveys out there. I love what Texas has been doing. I love what Abbey's been doing. You know, so if you see something, grab it.
One sort of unexpected benefit, I guess, of having a copy of the survey for us was that we had some system level administrators who were interested in us giving them potentially the data that came from each one of their institutions so that they would know what their institutions were doing. So in the first round, we had promised that the data would be anonymous, and so we did not give those answers out to the system level administrators. But we made a point of saying in the second survey, in the second round, that they should, you know, keep a copy of their answers, or they should reach out to their institutions who hopefully have kept a copy of their answers if they would like that information, so that they wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, but also we would be able to keep data privacy that way.
Also, we changed, if I remember correctly, the survey software. So we used a different one that automatically, when a respondent submitted their answers, they got a copy of their responses. So we could ask people to refer to their copy, because sometimes they approached us to request their answers later on.
I'm curious, would anybody like to share their continuous improvement process? You know, how do you solicit feedback to improve it from year to year?
I got lucky, I suppose, in that, people felt very comfortable reaching out and saying, here's the problem I had with the way this was worded, or asking questions about what something means. So I mentioned in the chat, getting FTE enrollment data was something that we had to clarify with people, because they'd say, you're asking how many students do we serve at our institution? What do you mean by that? Do you mean undergraduate students? Do you mean full-time enrollment students? Do you mean students including those that are part-time? And so we had to set a specific definition for what data we wanted there, or else it couldn't be applicable across the institutions. And then other things that came out of that were one of our first questions, do you have an OER initiative? Very loaded question. Very bad question in a way, because people might think an initiative, that means that this is something big that's supported across campus and has funding. But we changed that to say, do you have any planned or ongoing organized support for OER? Do you have some sort of support that is available for faculty that is looking at doing this work? And that helps people think a little bit more about anything that might be in place that could count towards this sort of question.
Abbey, I have to do a +1 on that. We had the same exact problem with a very similar question. There were certain institutions that responded, no, we don't have an initiative. And then we would have to go back and say, but yet we funded a faculty member from your institution with a grant. Oh yeah, but that's not a system-wide, that's not an institution-wide, that's just one person doing it. That counts. So that is a huge one right there, is just changing the language to be a little bit more broad.
I think
Go ahead, Judith. No, I honestly, I'm just going to say, to plus what are you, 2 at this point, plus 3, or whatever number we're at on whatever has been said. But Judith, go ahead, step in by all means.
Oh, Michelle, I was just going to say that, and this is kind of maybe gets us into the next category, the last category of what we're going to talk about. But I think if we're going to partner again on this survey next year, 2023, which would be the third biennial, then what is kind of a daunting challenge to me, but is a good one to have, is that thanks to the data that we have collected and that Texas has now, you have been able to implement a wide range of programs, initiatives, and delivery of resources in response to those data. And so now making sure that the next iteration of the survey takes that into account and has questions about the use of those resources, initiatives, and engagement with them, and the impact of them, that's daunting to me. It's like it's already a pretty long survey and a pretty, the scope is quite broad and wide and deep. So what questions are going to have to go? It's really going to be about, we don't want this survey to get too big, but boy, we really want to capture all of the amazing things that are happening in Texas. But that probably is a bridge to the next discussion about kind of what's next.
Well, before we get to what's next, part of that is, what was the end benefit? So we talked about all this effort we put into building the survey. We talked about the challenges and the lessons learned, but what about the final analysis, about the data? What did we learn? What was valuable about this whole exercise that made us do it again and again? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I'll go again. So I'll say the biggest thing for us was first just validation that there is something happening at all these institutions across the state. There are people that are doing OER work. We're not alone. It's not just the 5 to 7 of us in a room thinking we'll put out a survey and find out what happens. But also awareness to the administrators and people we're sending the survey out to that this is something worth exploring. I think there's been able to be more initiatives start up over the last 4 years because we're annually sending out a survey asking, are you doing anything? I think that gives a little bit of a push for people to support funding and development for these programs. But probably for us as the statewide Iowa OER group, still, again, a volunteer effort. One of the things we've gotten from this over the last couple of years is we've been asking people, what sort of support do you need to move your initiatives forward? What things would help you do this work better? And although we can't really offer much because we don't have funding or staffing, we were able to put together this year a consultations program for institutions to sort of fill that need of, I'm getting started, I have questions, I don't know where to get started with any of this work or how to address a faculty member with a question. And so we've just put together, again, a group of volunteer consultants that can reach out to people across the state as they have these needs. And we're hoping next year, again, like Judith said, to follow up on that and say, have you utilized this service? Did you know it existed? Is there something you'd like to change for it as we move into the next year?
If you don't mind, I'm going to jump in just because I think I mirror Abby's responses quite well. Not only did we have great validation with the results, there were the assumptions that we weren't doing as much OER as we were. And then when the data came in, it's like, wow, these institutions are actually doing something and at a larger scale than even the administration knew. So there was validation of the effort. But that we had the same thing is that we were sparking local efforts as well. Institutions that were spurred on because a legislative request came through for data. It's amazing how you can grab people's attention with those words. But for us, when we started looking through the data, there were some obvious pieces that we found about where pockets of OER was happening. We knew which institutions were sort of the leaders in the state. But when we started really looking at awareness and promotion efforts, we saw that everybody was focusing on faculty in the library to some extent to really go for those, to the adopters. But we saw that there was very little direct promotion or awareness among administrators and students. So we saw that we weren't doing as well of a job informing students and activating students. So that's a takeaway for us for future years. Michelle or Kylah or Judith?
I'll just say, and Kylah, I'll just say to kind of an introduction to what I think you're probably going to say is that the kind of value add that ISKME gives is not only analyzing the data, but providing recommendations for action based on those data. So maybe Kylah and Michelle, or something else, Kylah, you want to mention?
Yeah, no, I was going to say we put quite a few of those recommendations into play in the past couple of years, which is great. And I'm going to let Michelle talk a little bit about that, but I just wanted to say that it also really helps us with sustainability of programs, because we can use that data to sort of go back to the legislature and show the return on investment of what the funding that they've put into OER already. We can inform better some of the programs that are coming out of the legislature, like, for example, our OER grant program. Its funding for the first couple of rounds was directly to faculty members, like as individuals. We found in the second round of the survey that the institutions that were really successful in their OER work were doing sort of cross-institutional programming, like they really had multiple offices involved in their work. And so we can turn around and better design that grant program using that information. So that's just one example, but.
And that's on us. The grants program is one aspect, and then the services program, we do the exact same thing. And so we were able to design services around a lot of the findings within the survey, clear up some misconceptions. You know, when you're providing services in your service portfolio, you always hope that everyone is really excited about it, and you built these amazing things, and then are wondering, why isn't anyone using these, or what's going on, and where are these gaps that happen? And we saw some of that. Our understanding, the survey did demonstrate that there was this clear need and this passion that existed for OER at different campuses. It was valued highly. People were recognizing it. The awareness had gained traction since the first iteration. But then we saw this distinct other question that stated that our faculty training programs and the money going behind those was stagnant. And so you have this disconnect, and that allowed the coordinating board to come in and fill that gap and be able to create the services that institutions were no longer getting funding for, to create the opportunities and the programs necessary to make sure that our faculty have the resources that they needed from the central level. We have a very strong OER community in Texas. We are very proud of our OER community in Texas, because it truly is a focus on services for you, by you, where we bring together people from all different parts of the ecosystem that it takes to sustain OER. And so we definitely looked at having the research inform the different service portfolio that we had created, from academies, beginner academies, creator communities, to major conferences that we partner with others across the state. And as Judith mentioned, now the exciting thing will be is, are you aware of them? Are you engaged in them? Unfortunately, we did have some grant programs that we put in the survey that were available funding for institutions, and we got back a response and said, I had no idea. I had no idea that this was out there. And that's unfortunate. But what it tells us is, here's where our marketing efforts need to go. Here are the groups that we need to be talking to. And one of the subsequent very beneficial consequences of this survey was, we want to learn more. We want to continue researching and finding out, what exactly does this mean? And so we've continued our partnership, extended our partnership with ISKME, so that we could look at a geographical analysis, a regional analysis, so we could find out very pointedly, you know, Texas is a large state. And so there are definitely needs that are different based on the region that you're in. So we now are actively engaged in finding out. We had a wonderful research. Anastasia was definitely part of that team, leading that team under Judith's leadership as well, towards the tail end of it, and making sure that we're able to now very purposefully provide services for specific regions, so that the desire is there, and we can meet that need. In addition, we did an analysis for a gap analysis on our core and our highly transferable courses, because we understand that some of our courses have a lot of information and a lot of resources in our repository, which we'll put the link in the chat in a little bit, OER Texas. But we also realize there are some subject areas that do not have all the resources that we need. So now we can be very pointed in creating grants specifically to create content in those that do not have as much. So the research just sparks more research, and hopefully allows us to create a portfolio that adds value to the stakeholders in Texas.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that ISKME is not only a proud partner on this research with the coordinating board, but also we help to develop and implement a variety of professional development trainings for Texas as well. So really appreciate that partnership.
Well, it's great. It sounds like, you know, Texas is busy for the next couple of years, but Kylah, I wonder if you could expand on a side project that you're working on that may also benefit all of our audience.
Sure. So I had the good fortune to be part of the Spark Leadership Program this past year, and at my capstone project, I sort of realized that when I had started at the coordinating board and started doing OER work, I called a lot of people at different state agencies and things, trying to not reinvent the wheel as we started some of the OER projects in Texas. And that information is not really collected in one central area at this point for state level initiatives. So I am developing, or have developed, a survey for these sort of state level organizations, to collect information about the types of OER initiatives that they're engaged in, and hopefully collect not only data on that, but some of the sort of how to best practice information that we can then share in an action guide for state level agencies and organizations, so that that information can be shared and we don't have to start from scratch.
That's fantastic. Abby, can you tell us a little bit what Iowa's roadmap might be?
Nothing as exciting as Kylah's. So we're just keeping on. One of those things we mentioned, continuous improvement. Next year, what we'll be doing for our 5th annual survey is, instead of doing a calendar year, we've been putting these out every January. We'll be moving to a academic year approach, just to match what the colleges are already doing with their own data. So as we're putting out this information, people can more easily tie it into their own initiatives work.
That's fantastic. And for Connecticut, we are about to launch our 2nd round of this survey tomorrow, from what I understand. And as I mentioned before, we've added some improvements to the last question set. So we rephrased some things so that we can get a comparison from year 1 to year 2. But we also have some new questions in there that are specifically focused on non-credit and workforce content and support structures, and where there may be shortcomings within the support structures for each institution to support expanded use and adoption of OER. So folks, we are at the end of our sort of scripted area. So now this is free form. If you have questions, please use the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can let you off mute. Would love to hear from you all. While folks are thinking of questions, I'm going to say that one of my to-dos is going to be to continue to keep in touch with my panelists here so I can improve my survey based on their experiences. I've taken some notes through this, and we've already practiced this once, and I'm just continuing to learn new techniques or new thoughts to take away. We do have one question. So Veronica wrote, I'd love to see if any of the state surveys are asking whether students perceive value in the use of OER ZTC, for example, less debt, faster graduation.
Veronica, that's a great question. The Texas surveys do not survey students, so students are not respondents for the Texas statewide surveys.
That's the same for Connecticut.
Yeah, I think the hard thing for this is the level that we're aiming for. A lot of these questions are going to the institutions or the coordinators for the OER programs. The closest we get to that is a general awareness. How aware of OER are students, faculty, administrators, certain offices on your campus? But we could ask whether they've done student surveys before or how engaged they are with their students. Maybe, do you have student government involved in your programs? That might be something to look into in the future.
You have a question about student leadership, don't we, Anastasia, Kylah, Michelle?
Yes, we have a question that asks which strategies you have used to raise student awareness around OER, I think.
And I'll say we had a question about student awareness and what activities the institution was taking towards making students aware of OER options, but not directly surveying the students.
Although if you are looking for that information, there are some great models out there. I know Amanda Larson in the participants list has made some overviews on how to survey and work with students, and the folks again in Texas is UTA have their care survey for students that are in classes using OER. That's a little bit, that's a well-used one. Off the top of my head pulling things, but any other questions people have about how do you run these sorts of surveys? Are you thinking of doing something in your own areas as well?
I have a question about your survey design. You mentioned you all did some focus groups, like that's continuous improvement. If you do a focus group, then there could be certain data which you want to collect, for your systems, for each institution. In your focus groups, what helped you in your focus groups and redesigning some questions? Maybe identifying needs of some organizations or some initiatives. What did you get out of your focus groups that help you design your quantitative questionnaire, survey instrument, your quantitative survey data collection instrument?
I can throw an answer out there to start. I had the good fortune to work with the person who was overseeing our institutional research department. And, stupidly, I wanted all these open-ended questions because I wanted folks to provide narrative form, and I wanted these
Did we lose Kevin? Seems so.
It was such a great question. We
It
we
was.
lost Kevin.
I feel
Anastasia, I don't
just-
know if you want to start talking a little bit, and then when Kevin comes back on.
Yes, we did a focus group for a different project during the summer, but of course it was a different project, but it was very closely related to OER. It was about OER, and it was with Texas Institute, and this is when we realized that having one person respond on behalf of a college district probably is not necessarily the right approach, and I think this is my own thinking, and so maybe we could ask a college district in the future if there are different levels of implementation across the campuses, and then we could request, and then people could request to have one survey distributed to each campus, or if there is the same level of OER engagement and commitment, and it is the same person who will respond for all campuses, giving exactly the same answers, then one response could be accepted.
In the absence of Kevin, I just thought I would read a question. Thank you, Anastasia. I thought I'd read a question. Veronica's been such a wonderfully engaged participant in the session. We appreciate it, Veronica. She's asked, may we return to the previous reference to sharing back data? Are there any suggestions y'all have about how to make participating in this survey a value-added endeavor for universities and initiative leaders? What a great question and comment, Veronica. Thoughts?
I can speak to this one. I think one of the things that made our survey unique is that the promise was not, we'll give you back your data, but we will give you the final report so that we know that they're actually going to get a copy at the end and can see the overall landscape of the state so they can situate themselves within that. But in addition to that, what we've had some people get excited by is the overview of not just the survey results, but also a short introduction to what Iowa OER is doing. So our group, what support do we have available? Are you taking advantage of that? And when you share the survey and you answer the support that you need, that's getting you on the list of things that we might prioritize over the next year. So a way to get your voice heard and potentially bring forward things that are a concern for people across the state.
And I think we're very similar in that, is being able to encourage leaders to get the data, and then that they would be able to see the perspective of Texas and kind of where they stand in it. I think also the services that we provide in response to the data has been a very big, very visible way that university leadership has seen. We've been very fortunate that we have some great supporters and some of our CEOs at institutions that say, when you provide a service, you know, when we fill out these surveys, they prioritize it for their campus. I mean, their inboxes are flooded with things all the time, but they're able to prioritize this survey in particular because they've seen the results that have come from it, the academies, the conferences, the grants. And so there's a lot of incentive for them to participate because we are tailoring our different service catalog to their needs in particular based on their responses.
And these are not services that take years to stand up based on those data. It's amazing. The coordinating board is creating, developing, sometimes in partnership with ISKME, many times, these various initiatives, services, trainings very quickly. So I think that that also is an incentive. Welcome back, Kevin.
My internet quit before we did. How
So
are we
Kevin,
doing?
Yeah,
Do we
Kevin,
have any
you're
quick-
mentioning you were collecting qualitative data. Please continue with your thread.
That was 2 minutes ago. I honestly, I'd have to come back to that and just think where I was with that.
Based
Oh,
on what
just-
you
I
were
was-
saying, I'm guessing it's you wanted the big qualitative data, but then it was too hard to compare across the board.
Yes, and so the gentleman who oversaw our institutional research department pulled me from the edge and helped me develop question sets that were more quantitative. And while it didn't allow me to have all the data in the world, it also kept me from not sleeping at night and playing with data or narrative and polling. So again, just having somebody who has that experience to help guide you from a newbie who has no idea how to design a survey.
And doing multiple surveys over multiple years is so beneficial. It was so eye-opening when we were able to have comparative analyses from the first survey to the second. And I'm really looking forward to being able to do those comparisons with the 2023 survey.
And we've been so fortunate to dive into the research further. Like, I found it really interesting that when we did our regional analysis, like we have every region in Texas has OER stars, and every region in Texas has OER people who are or institutions who are just beginning. So that, you know, offers up all sorts of possibilities for new programming and mentorship and all sorts of things. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. Okay, one more question. Are you conducting annual surveys or every 2 years? It's different for all of us. So we're doing annual here in Iowa. Texas, what are you guys doing?
Every 2 years so far.
In Connecticut, it's every year. It's written in our legislation.
All right, so all different things. The last chance for someone to ask a question if you have something on your mind.
I just want to give a shout out to Rebel in the chat who clearly is quite well versed in this area. So thanks, Rebel, for adding all of that stuff in there. I'm really excited to hear about that template that you're designing. We'll probably be, in the spirit of open, sharing in that with you.
I think we're out of time.
Oh boy. Well, Veronica, I will follow up with you after this, or we've